Welcome to everyone. I have about a 40-minute talk to give, and then we'll have time for question and answer and discussion. And hopefully folks have a lot of interesting things they'd like to talk about. So my name is Miranda Rectenwald. I work in the Department of Special Collections at Washington University. And I have the fortunate position to have been working on the Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis project for the past about 5 years. And so that is the sort of connection to tonight's talk, although Pride Month is a nice excuse to get together and talk about history. I'll take pretty much any history month to talk about, or even any other month out of the year. So if you have been to one of our talks before or looked at the map before, I'm going to mention some updates, but the link is in the chat if you haven't seen the map before or would like to peruse it after the program. Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis is a collaborative project with many partners. Andrew Friedman in the History and Women, Gender Studies, Sexuality Department and I are the co-shepherds to this project, but we would not be able to do this without the work of many other people as well, and without the historical research done before us by some folks who are on this call with us, among others. And just as a little bit of background, very briefly, this is a online site. It is free. It's available to everyone. On the left is what the site looked like when we originally launched in 2017. And I'm happy to say that as of this spring, we've been able to move the pages and add some new content to a new mobile-friendly platform, which is what you will now be directed to if you go online. The old site is still online. I didn't want to cut that off yet, but the new URL directs you to the new site. But tonight we're going to look particularly at WashU history and how it overlaps and intersects with LGBTQ history. There's certainly earlier history that is worth delving into and talking about, but tonight I'm going to focus predominantly on the post-World War period through the 1990s, which is the time period that the mapping project focuses on of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. And just to orient us, since we're not able to be on campus and take an actual tour, we're going to start our virtual tour through this history on what people today call the Danforth campus, but 1945, 1990 was referred to as the Hilltop campus. And this is where Brookings Hall and the academic buildings are located, as well as South 40, the student housing complex. So we're going to start with a bit early, talking about just a variety of things. This is certainly not comprehensive, but I wanted to share some of the stories that I've uncovered. Some of these are linked on the map so far, and some of these I will be adding as we're finishing the updates this summer. So we've come across a number of interesting tidbits as we've been looking for history for the map. This is one of the earliest pieces that's directly connected to WashU. This is a review of Kinsey's book, Sex Habits of American Men, when it came out in 1948. And Professor Stuart Queen was a longtime professor of sociology, anthropology. He was the interim dean for a while. He was the director of the library for a while. He was very involved on campus. And I found his review in the Post-Dispatch offered some interesting insight. I wish that perhaps his optimism had been seen through. So in 1948, he wrote, perhaps they will, he says, clearly some changes are bound to come. Perhaps they will be in our attitudes toward so-called, quote, deviates, perhaps in our education system, perhaps in legislation and, quote, correctional procedures. Certainly after the Kinsey report, we cannot stand still, which was a very optimistic and social scientist outlook on things. Unfortunately, those not standing still bits don't happen much on the WashU campus in the 1950s. And so really, it's not until the 1960s that people on campus are talking about these subjects in a very open way. So two of the people I want to highlight here are two students, graduate students. One is a woman named Ethel Sawyer, who is a master's student in the sociology department. She, along with many of the sociology students, worked on a series of sociological studies and interviews that were conducted at the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex starting in the mid-1960s. And it's there that she met some young African-American women who began talking to her and invited her out to parties and the club that they went to nearby, which was called Bill's Bar and Grill. And with encouragement from her academic advisor, Sawyer began documenting their interactions, writing about them using anonymous names. And in 1965, her master's thesis was published, and it was a study of public lesbian communities, writing about this group of women who were living in Pruitt-Igoe and the surrounding area on the north side of St. Louis, and going to house parties, going to Bill's Bar. And so this is an early piece of scholarship. Now, unfortunately, Sawyer didn't get a lot of support in the wider sociology field. It's not too surprising. Sociology was going through a lot of changes in the 1960s, and there was a number of people who were trying to really push the envelope, but other people who really pushed back and were not so interested in being changes to the discipline. The name on the right you might be more familiar with, and that's Loud Humphreys, who was a PhD student in sociology, overlapping at this time. He came in shortly, right about the same time that Ethel was finishing up. And Humphreys began writing his PhD dissertation based on observations that he had of men meeting men for sex in local parks. Now, he anonymized this, but it's pretty clear from the thesis, which he publishes in 1968, called The Tea Room Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places. And then he publishes that trade publication the next year by the same title. It's pretty clear that he's talking predominantly about Forest Park. That is a fascinating bit of history, far too much to go into tonight. And while he is very well known for writing this piece in sociology circles, it's interesting what he offers in terms of St. Louis and Washington University history as well. He later comes out as a gay man and also writes additional books, including this one, Out of the Closet, where he reflects on his time in St. Louis and at Washington University. So it's a very interesting read. We're gonna kind of jump ahead through the decades. This is a great example of some of the most common things that happened on campus, which was guest speakers who were invited to campus and spoke at programs that were open to the general public. And so in 1974, as part of a sexual symposium that included Dr. Benjamin Spock and a publisher of Penthouse, Christine Jorgensen, as part of her speaking circuit, was on campus. This is a photo of her. It's dated 1974 on campus, although I'm not sure whose office she is currently visiting in. Spoke on campus about her role and her transitioning, which was part of what she did throughout the country, was travel and speak. Christine Jorgensen, if you are not aware, is one of the very earliest out Americans who we would consider trans today. At the time, the term used was transsexual. Now, this is certainly not the only instance of someone speaking on campus. There certainly were others. I have uncovered and am looking into trying to find more details about. In 1971, Audre Lorde was invited to speak as part of an African American, or at that time Black Studies panel. Also AIDS activists in the 1990s and 2000s. Many other people spoke on campus. When I mentioned I was doing this program, a couple of people commented on Facebook that they always look to WashU as a place that they could attend programs like this. And so that definitely is a very positive thing. What we're going to talk about tonight is some positives, some negatives. Many programs were put on by the Women's Programming Board on campus. These are a few of the examples. The Family of Women Lesbian Feminist Band. I'm still looking to date the year on that. That's one of my favorite posters. Sponsored Holly Near on campus in the 70s and in the 80s. She was back a number of times. There was a car care clinic that was run by Laura Ann Moore that was sponsored on campus. And the Women's Programming Board worked closely and really kind of intertwines and parallels with the establishment of the Women's Studies Department on campus. I'm not going to talk a lot about the establishment of women's studies on campus, but that's another fascinating aspect because there were a number of academic leaders in that what was at that point a program, and in only recent years has become a full department. But it really helps support women's programming and particularly lesbian focused programming on campus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about organizing. In 1977, one example of this organizing that's a good example of the blending of campus and community. The parking lot on the corner of WashU's campus was used as the meeting place for folks who were going to board a bus and go protest in Joplin, Missouri, the speaking of Anita Bryant, who was campaigning across the country on the Save Our Children campaign, speaking against gays and lesbians. So the university doesn't really have anything to do with this, but it is interesting to note that in 1977, the parking lot was familiar enough to people involved, and it was noted this was a safe place to leave cars for the day, and that wouldn't be a problem. It also notes that there's a number of local places where tickets to this are being sold, and those places also have a number of connections of people to Washington University. So it names the Women's Eye Bookstore, which was not too far from campus, and many folks from WashU were involved in that. The Women's Self-Help Center, same with that, and Tiamat Press, which was the women's press, as well as MCC and the social organizations. All of those are places that are marked on the map that you could find out more about if you were interested. Something that we mark on the map but is a less known piece of campus history is in 1977, the 4th National Conference on Men and Masculinity was organized and held on campus. There was over 300 people, men and women, who attended on the campus. And we actually, at the Washington University Archives, we have the program booklet and organizing notes for the group. It was explicitly aimed at supporting the women's feminist movement, supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. In fact, this national group voted while in St. Louis a resolution to support the Equal Rights Amendment. But they were also very explicit in the program book. It lists bars and clubs and restaurants that are friendly for gay and bi men. So it's very much an organization that was for what we would what they titled gay rights, but what we would think of today as LGBTQ rights. From this piece, the leader of the national movement spoke, and I thought it was interesting what he said. So I'll read a little bit of this since I know the print is tiny. He said, first, our outlook is anti-sexist. We support the struggle against economic and political oppression of women, which includes the social and professional or personal dimensions as well. Second, our outlook is anti-racist. Through this topic has yet to be better analyzed and spared the hit and run accusations. We support the struggle against economic and political oppression of non-white populations. Third, we stand against heterosexism and the oppression it visits on gay men and women. Included in that stance is the recognition of social homophobia, which keeps men of all sexual identifications separate. Fourth, we oppose the limitations of a culture which oppresses men and women equally, with carefully defined roles and imperatives tied to pink and blue ribbons. I am fascinated by this conference, and I cannot wait. The University Archives has recently been given a grant to digitize a number of audio recordings, including one that was some of the speeches given at this conference. So I am very much looking forward to hearing what those had to say. Men and Masculinity as a conference continues as an organization. It goes through a number of changes. They do return in the 1980s. I believe it's 1985, and they meet in St. Louis. And again, it's organized on campus. But the organizing that is most associated, that most people know about, are the earliest organized, advertised Pride events in St. Louis. So on the left, you'll see the Gay Pride Weekend from 1979. Get my numbers backwards. And that was the gay students, the concerned gay students of Washington University in St. Louis. As a group, we don't know much about them, but we don't think they were around for very long, maybe 1978 to 80, 81. And their Gay Pride Weekend in April, it announced, this weekend is our celebration of being gay and courageous in the Midwest, held in conjunction with the quarterly conference of the Missouri Coalition of Human Rights. And they say their exciting agenda includes a women's choir concert, a movie, relevant and stimulating workshops, including parents of gays, coming out and beyond, consciousness raising, lesbian separatism, chemical abuse, and much, much more. And then the creative typography, no gay pride celebration would be complete without a disco dance, they specify. From all accounts, this was a successful weekend that was well attended and enjoyed and had no problems on campus. And so the next year in 1980, two groups, one, a St. Louis celebration of lesbian and gay pride, and the other, the Magnolia Committee, which it's a little bit loose organizing, but they're community groups. They organize, and in 1980, they decide to go and get a parade permit so that they can have a march. The history of that is also fascinating. For purposes here, to me, the intriguing part is that in asking for the parade permit, asking the city of St. Louis for this parade permit, one of the selling points was that the march and rally would end at the university, go through the arch at the Brookings Quadrangle and end in the big grassy area. And to the city of St. Louis, it was suggested that this meant if there were any problems or policing needed, it would be the university's problem. Not that any were anticipated, but that the city wouldn't have to, deal with that. How much that influenced them, it's hard to say, but it's interesting to me that that was brought up as a sort of selling point. A number of things were planned over the week: picnics in Forest Park, more films shown, more workshops, some which were at Washington University and some were at nearby Forest Park Community College. And then finally, on Sunday, April 20th, the walk from Maryland Plaza and the rally at the Quadrangle. Shared in the chat is a link to more about Pride history if you're interested in more of this history. But we also have to look at 1981. Maybe look at 1981. There we go. And in 1981, the Celebration Organizing Committee decided that they would move the event to June to coincide with when celebrations across the country had begun holding their events in conjunction with June as Pride Month and in honor of the Stonewall Uprising and the Christopher Street marches. However, as they note here, at the last minute, the university rescinded its permission for the event to take place on the Quadrangle, and therefore it had to be moved to Forest Park. Now, I have not been able to find much documentation in the archives. It doesn't surprise me too much, especially because a lot of times things were done just through phone calls. But it seems that when the events were held in April, and while there were many community members with some students, it was still seen as something of a student-ish activity. And therefore, kind of anything goes. If there were students who wanted to do it, it went ahead. But in June, when there's not students around, suddenly this seemed less tenable. And so it was that they were told no, they could not organize and have this event on the campus. It's moved to Forest Park and stays in Forest Park actually through 1997 or 98. I'll have to double check, but that's on the Pride timeline. Which actually gets us to the 1980s and 90s when things are a little rockier on campus. One of the groups that really grows and emerges very strongly on campus is known as the Women's Resource Center. These are photographs from their early scrapbooks. They're not identified other than it says 1980. I think the one on the left is possibly a little bit earlier than that. From the hair, I believe 1980 on the right. The Women's Resource Center starts out organized by the Feminist Coalition of Washington University, which is a very strongly lesbian-focused student group in the 70s. And in the women's building, which is where the majority of women's groups met, since there are not at that time sorority houses on campus, all of the sororities and women's associated groups met in the women's building. They started the Women's Resource Center in 1976. And it was really a place, it was a place for meeting, for hanging out, for people to have lunch. It is a fascinating archival collection because they kept sort of like an open notebook, and people who were students who dropped by would just sort of jot a little note, or planning notes would get written in them. It has a bit of a rocky history. It starts out in the women's building, and it's there through 1981. And then in the 80s, it moves between Umrath Hall, which was where a number of other programs were located, including the Campus Y, and Prince Hall, which was at the time the campus activities building. Prince Hall no longer stands on campus. So it moved between Umrath and Prince, back to Umrath in 1992, and it stayed there in operation, although dwindling in popularity through about 2003. And the Women's Resource Center here, they offer a library, a periodic file, information and events, free condoms, pregnancy tests, a safe haven for women to relax in, as well as an open environment for men. And at various times, they had different groups meeting, including what they describe as a lesbian slash bisexual and questioning support slash rap group. So a lot of things were going on, and that was one of the major generators of a number of more events on campus, including this offshoot group in 1987, which is they had some brainstorming for their name, and they finally decide on, do you keep echoing Sappho's, or DYKES, Dykes. And they organized events, get-togethers, camping trips. Really a fascinating look at a few years of a lesbian separatist group on campus. The Women's Center and Women's Studies on campus also in 1984 and 1985, they organized and compiled these two publications called Writings About Women Speaking Out, which were really offer a very fascinating look into life on campus. So I pulled out a few excerpts from this particular issue, and these are both longer documents that are available in the archives. So in 85, Cindy Deutschman, she wrote an essay called Harassment on South 40, where she chronicled and reflected on the harassment she and her roommate faced. She talks about how they were members of the Gay and Lesbian Community Alliance, which was a group that formed in the mid-'80s. And that they'd put up posters to events and come back and have them ripped off their door, or have their poster corkboard damaged and ruined. And so she reflected on this and sort of what it taught her about what it meant for how homophobia and the patriarchy were influencing her and her roommate's life. Another piece is by a graduate student named Martha Hanlon. And Martha wrote a piece called Confronting Heterosexism, and she contrasts her life on campus as an out lesbian woman who comes to St. Louis from the East Coast, and she talks about some of the differences and things she encounters. So all of these offer just a variety of insights, much more than I can go into tonight, or that we can go to on the map. But our hope is that through the Mapping LGBTQ St. Louis project, that tidbits of this history will be out and available, and hopefully spark the interest of further people to do more research and exploration of this history. I wanted to include this also because the late 80s, early 90s are not a good time on campus. So this is the 1988 yearbook called The Hatchet, and this is the Gay and Lesbian Community Alliance, which pictured the chairs and officers, but then 3 individuals chose to have their backs turned in the picture, and they're listed as Mr. X, Mrs. XX, and Mr. XXX for anonymous. And then the following year in 1989, the group doesn't include a photograph or listing in the yearbook at all. A case that comes shortly after this in 1989 and 1990 is Jim Hallibuck, who transferred from the Springfield, Missouri area where he had been going to school near Rolla. He transfers to Washington University. He's in the engineering program, and he's in the ROTC. And as he gets close to graduating in 1990, he decides that he's approaching graduation. He is fallen in love. He has a steady partner, and he decides that he doesn't want to remain closeted anymore. He feels this is, not going to work for his life moving forward. So he goes to his commanding officer in the ROTC and he tells him this. And at first, nothing sort of happens. And then he's called in for interrogation and interviews. And And in a very abbreviated form of the story, he is ordered to pay back all of the scholarship money that the Department of Defense has paid as an ROTC officer. This is something he is able to work with the ACLU and challenge in court. In 1992, he publishes this book, Torn Allegiances, and he writes about his life growing up and his life coming to WashU and coming to St. Louis and what it was like for him to go through this, and ultimately that it was a positive thing for him, but it was also a very painful thing. He was actually not out to his family because he couldn't quite come up with how to tell them. But when the story hit the New York Times, he knew he had to call them because clearly they were going to find out. The university is, I would say, moderately supportive to supportive of, at least the university administration, I should say, of his effort. They did speak up on his behalf and say that they felt it was wrong, that the policy was discriminatory, that he shouldn't, have to pay this back. A number of student groups organized protests, writing letters, speaking out, very much opposed to ROTC even operating on campus or the Department of Defense recruiting on campus because of their discriminatory policies. And ultimately, Jim Hallibuck was not required to pay back the money. It was figured out in the courts after a few years. And today, the Hallibuck Awards are given on campus in his honor. All right, keeping an eye on time. I do want to very briefly mention a few stories to shift over to the east side of Forest Park, a few stories of WashU history on the medical campus. This is really, again, another kind of very different aspect of WashU history, but there's a few very interesting cases and tidbits of history we came across in mapping these stories that I wanted to share with you. So the first is this case on the left, which it occurs in 1954, although the newspaper clipping is from 10 years later, from 1964. And today we would understand this as a person who was intersex, who had been identified as female at birth, but at age 13, it became apparent that this person was male. And so they underwent surgery at Washington University by plastic surgeons and gynecological specialists. And the surgery was successful. And this article is celebrating the fact that this person, who's unnamed, and we don't know their name today, had, in the intervening years since their surgery at age 13, gotten married and now had a child that they had successfully been able to have a biological child. The article offers some interesting positive and negative language. So the surgeon is quoted as saying he was always a boy, but his parents didn't know it, which is a fascinating phrase and really, considering 1964, fairly positive. Then they go on to clarify for the newspaper that they didn't consider this the same as a change that someone who at the time was considered a transvestite would have undergone, although they're not entirely negative about that. It's a fascinating case to me. I would love to know more about it, but so far I haven't come across anything. It is, however, somewhat connected to a clinic that is established by 1975 at the School of Medicine. that is looking at helping people who need medical care for what is at the time termed someone who is transsexual. A comprehensive clinic is established by 1975 that includes both therapy and surgery. There's also in 1964 a clinic that is established, 1966, called the Gender Identity Clinic. This is an interesting piece of the medical school that studies and looks at people's understanding of gender. Dr. Eli Robbins and Dr. Marcel Singh want to better understand the ideas behind heterosexuality and homosexuality. They actually contact the Daughters of Bilitis in California and ask for the names of people they could write to survey about their attitudes about sexuality, among other things that other work that they do. And eventually some of the publications that come out of this help establish in psychiatry the idea of that gender identity is something that is an innate fixed part of a person and not something that is just merely changeable. But it is still very early, and much greater nuance of psychology and psychiatry advances after that. The medical school is also, sorry, my slide won't advance. The medical school is also very much associated with the history of the medical fight against HIV/AIDS in St. Louis. This again is a very long history, but it is some of the earliest work to combat it starts at Barnes Hospital and the School of Medicine. Here in 1983, there's a St. Louis Metropolitan Task Force on AIDS that is formed. And this is a year after the first cases are identified officially in St. Louis. The intriguing thing to me is I have never looked into this, and I'd be curious someday, is that the St. Louis Task Force on AIDS lists an address that's not at the medical school. It lists an address in Creve Coeur. And so I'm assuming this is the home number and home address of someone on the committee. But it's an intriguing clue. There are certainly many other task force meetings, fundraisers, educational programs, and along with medical testing and clinical trials that occur, but it begins in 1983. All right. So as I've said, just a tip of the iceberg of bits and pieces. I would encourage you, the new, more mobile-friendly site allows you to do some searching and exploring on your own. You can view and kind of browse by area, so you can go to Tower Grove, or you can go to St. Louis City or County. You can just pan around and zoom, and you can also search by putting in. So a lot of the sites I decided to include tonight, I searched Washington University and was able to find those, and medical and things like that. But the new site also has some guided tours. One for Washington University is one I've thought about adding. It currently isn't there. But we do have one for Forest Park, and it offers a look at just all sorts of different things happening. So it talks about Pride in 1981 and since then, and it talks about the popularity of Forest Park as a cruising location, a place where fundraisers and St. Louis Effort for Aid held charity walks, and softball teams met, and just sort of looks overall. And the others similarly look at different places and provides kind of a snapshot history. And then we still do have extended virtual tours that look at deeper topics like the impact of segregation, and looking at race and the intersection with LGBTQ life in St. Louis. We have 2 essays. One looks at going beyond gender binaries, and one looks at sex in the city, looking at these topics in just different lenses. And then we also have a page that looks at the history of how we put this site together, if you're curious more about that. I will tell you the About page is not yet updated with the newest 2020-21 updates, but those will be added soon. And then looking ahead, we're hoping, right now Andrea Friedman is working on another essay called Out with Love that's looking at religion and LGBTQ life in St. Louis. At the end of the month, it's very exciting. Trinity Episcopal Church will be holding a dedication ceremony to recognize that they have been honored as a national historic site. They're on the Register of National Historic Sites, both for Missouri and nationally. And they're having an event the end of the month, along with some additional oral history work that we're hoping to continue once students are back on campus.